there was a globe, and there were stairs going up and down the globe. Having fallen all the way down the stairs, his face hitting the floor, was John Bull, the symbol of Britain. Already stumbling, not yet completely collapsed, but clearly on his way down, was our own nation's symbol, Uncle Sam. Who do you suppose is striding up the stairs, eyes heavenward, the center of power in Kennedy's view of how the world would play? It was Japan. It was a Japanese salary. Now, many economists at the time, I actually wrote an essay on this in the late 1980s, were very skeptical about this for some of the reasons I talk about in the book Balance. That understanding economic power requires a knowledge of technologies that can move a frontier, not catching up to a frontier. And the Japan of that day did not strike me, or many economists, as being that country. Now, not to blame historians, no less an economist than Paul Samuelson, perhaps the greatest economist of modern times, fell into the same trap. Samuelson used to have an exhibit in his Principles of Economics textbook, which was the best-selling textbook of its day, showing the year in which the Soviet Union would pass the United States in economic output. With each edition, the year kept moving as a goalpost, and in the early 90s, the reference just seemed to disappear from the book. So it's not just historians, and of course today China is the boogeyman. It's not Japan, it's not the Soviet Union, it's China. Now, the Balance thesis is about understretch, not overstretch. It is that political institutions are such that a great power understretches. It looks inward, it fails to exploit its natural outward advantages, and its politics don't keep up with economics. And while I won't go through it much in my remarks, I did put a little bit of economics in the book. I think it is important to understand, particularly for leaders, to understand what are the sources of the wealth of nations. As an economist, I think of it as being about three S-named economists, Smith and Solow and Schumpeter. Smith talked about scale, really, and division of labor. And in today's economy, we would think GDP or something like that would be the consummate Smithian definition. Solow, of course, focused our attention on the future, on investment as being the indicator of a growing and successful economy. And Schumpeter, of course, focused attention on innovation, where the frontier is. In the book, my co-author Tim Kane and I do suggest a measure of economic power that I won't talk about much this afternoon, but that it is an amalgam of GDP growth and productivity. And in that measure, you can see why the U.S. is considered the preeminent economic power. And for the foreseeable future, at least by our judgment, Tim's and mine, is likely to be so, but it's not manna from heaven. Now, in Rome's case, and this will sound perhaps eerily familiar to today, rather than overstretch, we have building a wall to forestall immigration. We have a fiscal policy that favors the present over the future, and currency debasement. I don't know if any of this sounds familiar in today's headlines. The Roman diagnosis, which played out over many, many years, the fall was not a single battle or conquest, but followed pretty much that playbook. The Roman episode is not at all unusual of politics problems for great powers. One of the other case studies that Tim and I look at is China, but Ming China, 15th century China. I'm sure if you're like me, every school kid of my era learned about the 7 great voyages of Cheng Ho in the transliteration of the time I was a boy. And a century before Columbus's voyages caught our attention, China, of course, had the commercial envy of its day in terms of a massively successful fleet, and would have dominated the world had the policies of that time continued. The fleet was not only a source of wealth, it was a source of bringing in new technologies and information to China. The problem is, just as in Rome, a series of Praetorian guards had acted as a rent-seeking elite, tutors, court eunuchs around the emperor felt that the rise of the merchant class, which was benefiting handsomely from this trade, was taking away from their own power and influence Eventually, the ships are ordered to be destroyed and commerce simply stops. If you look at trade volumes and production data for China during this period, to the extent that such data are reliable, you see a true cessation of growth. It's as if somebody had come in and bombed a civilization, something quite terrible indeed. Imperial Spain is another case study that Tim and I consider. You know, the expression, the sun will never set, is thought of by many as being about Britain. The line was actually written about Spain. Spain was the empire of its day, and a classic example of not understanding the sources of wealth. Spanish rulers, a series of them, thought that wealth was gold and silver, not institutions, not knowledge, not technology. A series of poor fiscal policies, the failure of politics to engage the contemporary economics of the day, and a mercantilist trade policy ultimately bring Spain down. Now, Britain is a very interesting story in here because in some sense Britain should classically fit Kennedy's thesis. We do know that Britain way overspent in World War I and World War II. That's undeniable, and Britain left the Second World War exhausted and unable to defend the territory that it had held. Having said that, Tim and I actually go back to not only our own thesis, but to early work by both Adam Smith and William Pitt the Elder to suggest something else in Britain, a failure to be British. That is, while inside Britain a classic liberal, free trade, outward-looking policy was pursued, the colonies, as we know famously here from 1776 events and onward, were not accorded that same sense of Britishness. It was argued by both Smith and William Pitt the Elder that this was a seminal mistake and might lead to the empire's downfall. We also talk about the Ottoman Empire in the book, often identified as the so-called sick man of Europe. Nothing of the case in its early period. The Ottoman Empire was actually an administrative marvel. And it's a great story in political institutions and capture, because it was a marvel because of the Janissary Corps, an elite group of slaves who rose to administrative positions in the empire, and the head of which was actually the Grand Vizier, typically to the Sultan, so the chief technocrat of the realm. Eventually, though, the Janissary Corps starts to appropriate power for itself, much as the Praetorian Guards, the court eunuchs, the handlers of the Spanish emperors, and so on. Japan is a case study in the book, seen through the lens of the game of Go. An interesting story because in Go, which is a very complicated game, of course, the opening moves are much like fresh paint on a canvas because anything is possible. The end, we kind of know what's going to happen. In the middle is where all of the action is. In the book, we talk about the evolution post-war of state-managed capitalism, the interest groups that it created, and why Japan had such a hard time cracking U.S. levels of income. A couple of other case studies I'll just mention in the book that are chapters. One is on the Eurozone, where fiscal institutions, as we all know from current news, are not up to snuff. And the final case study before coming to America today is actually the state of California. Now, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm entitled to include California as a foreign country with all the other countries that I've talked about. And what's interesting about California, it is the only major landmass outside the Mediterranean that shares the wonderful climate of the Mediterranean. It also, however, shares something else with the Mediterranean, a totally dysfunctional political system. And what we talk about in the book is how a very rich state with such wonderful opportunities has managed to push itself to the edge of a potential growth crisis. The modern version of the Praetorian Guards or court eunuchs or teachers' unions and public employees' unions, so perhaps less dramatic than a eunuch or a slave, but powerful nonetheless. Now to come to the United States. We have a quote in the book from Yeats from The Second Coming that things fall apart and the center can't hold, and an observation that while in Eisenhower's period both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party sought his favors to be a nominee, nothing like that figures in policy discussions today. The real issue facing this empire, this great power, is fiscal. It's not an overstretched military issue, it's fiscal policy. And indeed, we have very high and rising debt to GDP ratios in the United States. We're on track in the next decade to achieve our World War II level of debt to GDP, but we didn't just fight World War II. This is a problem. You probably saw the kerfuffle over the Reinhardt-Rogoff type calculations of so-called tipping points when debt gets too high. Economists don't really know the answer here, but we can do arithmetic. We know that high and rising debt to GDP ratios mean a combination of things. Either the taxes have to rise substantially to defease that debt, meaning slower growth, or spending on much of what folks think government does has to be cut. Defense, research, education, whatever your favorite public good is. Now, to see where all this is coming from, I want you to imagine with me something. Imagine a picture, and I'm going to ask you for the United States, but I could be asking you on behalf of almost any industrial economy. Let's look from the time of the American Revolution to about 1970 and plot the debt to GDP ratio. Anybody have an idea about what that looks like? No numbers, just shapes. Up, down, sideways. Any ideas? Revolution, 1970. Down.
Two big spikes.
Spikes. Correct answer is spikes. The correct story for most great powers, and certainly in this period, is war and peace. So when you fight a war, you borrow a lot of money. After the war, you stop spending so much. GDP grows, and both the numerator and the denominator are restoring it. That's how it's supposed to work. To give you an example, the debt to GDP ratio right after World War II was a little over 100%. That number was 40% by 1960. That's how it's supposed to work. Our budget institutions are built for that era. The battle we just fought over the debt ceiling has a little bit of interesting history itself. The debt ceiling laws come from World War I. And prior to World War I, the Congress had to vote on every bond issue. And because of the size of the military actions in World War I, the thought was we would give the Congress more breathing room to carry out the war before having to reauthorize debt, because we all, quote, know that after the war, debt falls. That, again, is how it's supposed to be. Now, what do you suppose the picture looks like after 1970? I could ask for the US, but I could ask you for a European country. I could ask you for Japan. It's just rising. There are bumps along the way. We have periods of sobriety and binging, but basically we're marching straight up. And you have to ask yourself, well, what's different about this world? Now, the Kennedy thesis, which was clearly written in this period, still argued that it was military spending. Now, there's no doubt that the United States spends a lot of money on the military in terms of the aggregate dollars. But again, if you normalize by GDP, normalized by the scale of the economy, American military spending has been on a steady march down since the Second World War. And indeed, today, most serious debate over defense spending in Washington is whether it's to be maybe 3% of GDP or 4% of GDP if you're a, quote, hawk. These numbers are small relative to what has actually been driving spending, which of course we all know is the change in entitlement programs. A series of actions in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the founding of Medicare and changes in the structure of the Social Security program led to a huge march up in spending and debt accumulation in these programs. In 1971, Medicare and Medicaid combined were only 1% of GDP. We're 6 times that last year and are on track within the next decade to double again. If we carry the clock forward one generation, the Congressional Budget Office tells us that we're going to spend about 10 percentage points of American GDP more on just Social Security and Medicare than we do today if we make no other changes. Now, there's a problem with that because in the public eye, something must give. You know, Herb Stein famously said something to the effect that something that's growing too fast will stop. That we know. The question is how. The tax increases required to service debt like that would be an absolute growth killer for the economy. And if we tried to cut military spending, education, research, any other spending you want, there's simply not enough of it left. You know, the public imagines that government spending is about what in Washington is called discretionary spending, defense, education, all those things. Those as a share of the budget are declining. Now, if the problem is entitlements, why isn't it a technical problem? Well, this is not one that economists don't understand. You could bring before you 10 economists, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, and they may differ around the edges, but their diagnosis of the problem will be approximately the same. And the only sense in which they might differ is on the remedy, how much of it should be done through revenue increases or spending cut. But the notion of this being a huge problem is an absolute technical consensus. There is no one serious who I think would disagree. The problem isn't that, it's politics. And to see why, I think you need to think about 3 things. One is the classic economist joke. The second is the game of basketball. And the third is the Odyssey, the book. Now, the classic economist joke. Now, this one pains me because, as you can tell by looking at me, I am the classic economist. And you've probably heard it, but in the off chance that you haven't, I'll put us all on common ground. So there's a chemist and a physicist and an economist marooned on a desert island. You're probably already feeling for the chemist and the physicist. And a can of soup or stew washes up to shore, and the physicist says, let's beat it open and we'll eat it. The chemist says, no, that's too messy. Let's heat it, it'll pop open, it'll be warm to boot. And the economist famously says, assume a can opener. The problem with the technical arguments that dominate our policy discourse today is we're assuming the can opener. We're assuming we have a good government. We're assuming that the politics can do this if only the smart guy or gal on a white horse came in to do it. And that's not true. Now here's where the game of basketball is important. Basketball nearly died as a competitive sport in the 1930s. And it suffered from something written in that day that was called the tall man problem. So in that day, with the structure of the court and the absence of a shot clock or a three-point shot, winning the game could be possible simply by having the tallest guys. So if you had the tallest guys and you dominate the lane, you win. Now, that's great if you happen to have the tallest guys. It's really not exciting to watch, as it turns out. And there was a great deal of debate among basketball aficionados as to how to fix it. Well, enter a man named Howard Hobson. Now, Howard Hobson comes to my attention because, believe it or not, he writes a PhD dissertation at Columbia. So this is a day when college basketball coaches get PhDs from Ivy League universities. It's a different world than the one we currently live in. But Howard Hobson wrote a dissertation, it's called Scientific Basketball, if you want to go purchase yourself a copy, and came up with the idea of the three-point shot. Three-point shots debuted in 1945 between Columbia and Fordham. Columbia wins, I'm pleased to say. It works its way slowly into college ball. Pro ball makes the career of one Michael Jordan and makes an important point. Sometimes, even something very successful has to change the rules. Now, the book, The Odyssey, I think, gives an idea about how to change the rules. We all know the story of the sirens. It's one of my favorite stories from the Odyssey. It's a story of temptation. It's also a story of leadership and solving problems, I suppose, where the men are told to put wax in their ears so they can continue to do the real work of rowing the boat. The sirens' song and appearance is so tempting, it's great to pursue them, except bad things happen to you, of course, if you go that route. Now, what does our leader do, Odysseus? He lashes himself to the mast. That's his famous response, thereby being able to take the opportunity of the siren song, but not lose his life in the process. Now, the question is, what would it mean if we're off track fiscally and our political institutions were built for a different era? How on earth are we going to change the rules and tie ourselves to the mast? Well, I would argue that there's light and heavy rope that we could consider. Light rope would be of the form, let's take the programs that are putting us in this circle, which are Social Security and Medicare, and take the change in accrued liabilities on those programs and put them on the budget. It's exactly what a business would do. So if I own a business and I promise things to all of you, I have to account for that now. I don't get to delay the accounting for it in the future. Just have Congress obey the same rule. That simple change would force the Congress to go to the American people annually and suggest that they need to raise taxes to pay for that, cut some other spending, or change these programs. That is, make a choice. The current system is a kind of what Tim and I talk about in the book of political prisoners' dilemma gaming, where neither side has to make any sacrifices because there's no choices. One side gets tax cuts, the other side gets spending increases, but our children, of course, get something else entirely. So a heavier rope would actually be an amendment to the Constitution. Now, I never thought that I would suggest this, but balanced budget amendments that have been currently considered have largely been poorly formed. I think most economists, certainly myself included, have been very skeptical about them because they would exacerbate business cycles. Let's suppose we ran a deficit in the middle of a significant recession. We don't want to raise taxes. That's a bad idea. But it doesn't mean that we have to throw out the idea of lashing ourselves to the mast. One kind of rule, talk about in the book, is a spending limitation that says, why don't we take federal spending and limit it to a moving average of 7 years inflation-adjusted revenue. I picked 7, honestly, because it was in Pharaoh's dream, but if you like 6, 8, 9, it doesn't really matter. The idea is to average across business cycles. Inflation adjustment obviously gets rid of the problem of nominal and real. And differing from conservative brethren, I don't think we should bias the Congress toward one solution or another. And it's perfectly fine with me if the American people decide they want to raise taxes. I don't happen to agree with it, but that's a political call, and it's not mine to make. So we would say that it should be symmetric. Congress can do whatever it wants. And in fact, Congress can have exceptions to this, as long as it understands that with each passing year, an escalating supermajority, 3/5, 4/6, 5/7, will be required to have that departure from the rule. Now, why am I optimistic that we can do something radical here? I mean, it's tempting to say these are problems, we all agree, but there's nothing we can do about it. We're all fed up with politics. But there are a couple of case studies in the very recent period that suggest some hope. Both Sweden and Canada nearly hit the wall. Both countries made very substantial, not just budget technical changes, but process changes to bring their budgets under control. And this is in the modern period. Another source that I have, which may well be very controversial, has to do with competition for political ideas. I wrote an essay over the summer in Foreign Affairs that got me a fair amount of, let's say, negative mail because I advertised my support for the Citizens United court decision. And my argument is that of an economist that unwittingly perhaps, since the early 1970s, campaign finance laws gave a monopoly in fundraising to the Democrat and Republican parties. So it's not an accident that prior to this period, the bell curves of those parties actually overlap substantially. After this period, they pull apart as if they're almost drawing balls out of two completely different urns. And any candidate is very dependent on his or her political party for support. An open system, which is the Citizens United system, says I can give money not just in large amounts to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, I can give it to whoever I want. You will see nutty ideas as a result, just as some businesses open up that should not. But competition is as valuable in politics, surely, as it is in business. Now, I think it's fair to say that this case study of Praetorian Guards through history, and they've taken on different identities in each of these great power case studies, suggests the importance of adaptive and malleable political institutions. It could be Praetorian Guards, it could be tutors and eunuchs, janissaries, teachers, or simply the forgetting of the future. And this is something on which we have to focus. And to conclude, I think of this as being about sort of two pictures to summarize the fork in the road that we are now at. One, let's suppose I have a picture here of Agatha Christie, and here I've got a picture of Ben Franklin. Now, I always loved Agatha Christie books as a kid. I mean, what was not to like? I grew up in a small farm town, so to read books of
posh castles and wealthy people coming for dinner parties with mystery. That was nice. And one of my favorites was And Then There Were None. And in the book And Then There Were None, posh dinner party, everybody's having a good time until someone is murdered. That put a slight damper on the evening, as it turned out, but not for long, until someone else was murdered. And the title of the book gives it away, And Then There Were None. That's how great powers actually fall. They don't fall from overstretch and military conquest. They fall much as And Then There Were None. A political institution does not make the changes, even when the murders, in the Agatha Christie sense, tell it should. But there is another fork in the road, and that's a picture of Ben Franklin. One of my favorite Franklin stories was Franklin's comment at the end of the Constitutional Convention that he had been spending his daydreaming time, I suppose, staring at the back of George Washington's chair and noticing that on the back of the leader's chair was a sun. And he was trying to ask himself, was the sun rising or setting? And he concluded that it's rising. There is every reason to believe that this nation's assets and liabilities taken together will make it the preeminent economic power. The math behind that's in our book. You could challenge if you like. But it isn't manna from heaven. And getting our political institutions right is an important part of the problem. So I'll stop there. But
Thank you.
sure. Okay.
Thank you.